Hi, I'm Doug McDougall. I'm the chair of the Department of Curriculum, Teaching and Learning at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. With me today is John Hattie, Professor and Director of Research at the University of Melbourne. John, in your book you write about Know Thy Impact. What message are you trying to get to your readers?
Well, over the years, Doug, I've struggled with trying to come up with what's the story underlying all these data. And like as a person who's trained in measurement, in fact, my PhD's here from University of Toronto, in measurement, that the message that was drummed into me back then is not about the data, it's about the interpretation. And so my frustration has been that, yeah, I've got plenty of data, I've got 300, 250 million kids, etc. But what's the story? And what I've learned is it's not about who teachers are, it's not about what teachers do, it's about how they think. And the phrase that seemed to sum it up the best is know thy impact. If teachers, if school leaders walk into a classroom in a school and they start with that assumption, my job here is to know what impact I'm having on kids' learning, then all the rest follows, all good things follow. And so that's where I've come to at the moment, to saying that's the kernel of the idea. In fact, I wished I could have called the book that. I wasn't allowed to by the publishers, but to me, that's what it's about, as the core of the notion.
So the book is called Visible Learning. So what should teachers see in their classroom? What should they be looking for? What's important there?
Well, the reason for choosing that title is that the argument is, how do we make learning visible through the eyes of the students to the teacher? And so can the teacher see the learning going on? For example, sometimes we have to perhaps stop talking and be a little bit more listening in terms of what's happening in classrooms. Maybe through the activities that we give kids, we need to use that as, in a sense, the eyes of the learning of the students so we can see our impact. And so that whole argument is, how can we be open up to seeing what learning's going on? Now, the other half of the equation is that we love to use in education fancy words, self-regulation,
reflection,
all that kind of stuff, lifelong learning. And really it comes back to this notion when students see themselves as their teachers, as their own teachers. That's what self-regulation means. That's what lifelong learning means. So the two parts of it is, how do we make learning visible to the teacher? And how do we make teaching visible to the student? And that's where the connection came with this notion of trying to make it visible.
I noticed in your previous book on visible learning, you were looking at 800 mega-analysis, and then the second book, taking a look at visible learning for teachers, and you've added another 100 or so that you've looked at. But you also identify a list of influences, maybe 100 of them in the list, but the top 5 seem to be really important. How did you get yourself to those top 5?
Well, and I sometimes feel very responsible for creating this league table, because what I don't want to happen is for teachers to look at the top 5 and say, I can tick those off. Right. And then look at the bottom ones and say, I don't do that. Because some of the ones at the bottom worry the hang out of me that they're at the bottom. They shouldn't be. Right. Like teacher subject matter knowledge. It shouldn't be at the bottom. But if you look at the top 5, what I'm more interested in is the story about the top half a dozen. There's 150 odd there. But when you look at what's the common story, yeah, I can look at the top 5 and I can say, there, but some of the ones that are 10, 15, 20 are keys to why the top 5 are there. So it's not just the top 5, it's the story underlying that. And that's what I was saying before about know thy impact.
Right. From my work is in mathematics education, and so we do a lot of work with teachers and trying to get them to understand themselves as a facilitator. But you also bring in the word as the idea of an actor, right?
An activator, yeah, look. I struggle with this notion of facilitator. I struggle with constructivism. I struggle with inquiry learning. I struggle with discovery teaching, because they're right down the middle to the bottom. And I think it's because we've forgotten that in any series of lessons, it's about a proportion of surface and deep knowledge, about what we know and how we think about it. And the argument I'm making in the book is, when we're novice at learning something, we need a lot more content. And as we get more proficient, we can start and then look at the strategies. But the mistake we often make with those kinds of facilitation notions is that our job is to facilitate the inquiry and the critical thinking, etc. Well, you can't think about things, you've got something to think about. Now, what I do worry about sometimes we stop with the surface level, we'll never get beyond it. And one of my worries is that when you look at how we teach in classrooms, it's very dominated by teacher talk and lone activities. That encourages very surface level work. And if you want to get to things like how students construct knowledge, facilitative inquiry, Carl Writer, I think he's done the most stunning work on this. He's shown that you have to explicitly teach it. And so that's why I'm not a favour of that. Your job as a teacher is to activate that learning. And there are lots of ways you activate it. And one of the most important thing is know where the learner is. Where are they on this journey from what they don't know to where you want them to know?
So one of the features of an activator is there's an action. It's active. The teacher's doing something. Where a facilitator could be a passive role. I'm just going to give you the papers, give you the materials, and
guide on the side. That's absolutely the wrong metaphor completely.
Because we're not at the side. We're in the middle. We're at the side.
Like most of us, when we learn something, we need someone to help us learn things. Now, of course, there's lots of ways we can do it by ourselves, but we do need some, your job as a teacher is to change. And my goodness, does that bring the moral imperative as what we want to change? As it should. Yeah. And we should be very clear, both to ourselves, and I would argue to the students, what it means to be successful in this change. I think one of the frustrations I have is so many times in schools, kids are told, just wait. When we get to the end of this, I'll tell you whether you've mastered it or not. Well, for some kids, you can't stop them. But there's a lot of kids in our schools, they give up on that, and we're losing them.
So here at OISE, for example, we have over 1,000 pre-service students, and we have over 100 instructors. So what kind of advice would you give the instructors who are then working with potential teachers, future teachers, in how best to teach them and how, so to get the idea that they're not just passive, there's an action, there's something happening here.
Well, this may seem strange, Doug, but my first piece of advice is stop teaching about teaching. And I think the mistake we make is that we get our brand new students to come up with some what we think are very good methods. And if they have these very good methods, they'll become good teachers. And then when I go and look at the evidence, such as in those two books, you'll find that there's just as many methods above as below the average. You'll find that some teachers are very good at implementing them and some are not. But more importantly, you'll find some kids get it with one method, but they don't get it if you do that method 2 or 3 times. You need something different. So where I start is that the hardest thing you have to do in teacher education is to convert the students from thinking of themselves in the classroom as a learner to themselves in the classroom as a teacher of learners. And that's why I come back to these mindsets. Like what I've realized, it's not who teachers are, it's not what they do, it's how they think. And if we can teach our beginnings teachers that their fundamental role is to diagnose, intervene, and assess their impact, from that, all other things follow. And so, as we're doing in our program at the moment, we're turning the whole thing on its head, we're using backward design, and we're saying to our students, we want to give you the skills of diagnosis. We want to give you the skills of finding out what the best interventions are relative to that diagnosis. But most of all, we want you to constantly say, what impact am I having? What impact am I having on all my students? And when we assess them on those things, we don't worry about the content, we don't worry about the methods, they come. And what students realize very quickly when they have a diagnose, intervention, and impact notion is that they need multiple strategies. They need subject matter knowledge content. But our mistake too often is we turn it the other way around and we give them good teaching methods, we give them good classroom, we're stunning at giving them good activities. But we never ask to shift your mind. You're not a student in those classes anymore, you are a change agent and therefore know your impact.
So you have described 8 mind frames or sets in here, and how are they used in your pre-service program?
Well, if you look at those 8 mind frames, 5 of them are the same thing, just said differently. Know their impact. Your fundamental job is you are an evaluator of yourself. And certainly what we're doing in our programs is we've got a series of 4 or 5 questions which dominate every class, every session. All of us have agreed to sign on to these ones about diagnose, intervention, and evidence. And let me be very clear here, evidence is an incredibly contested notion. Evidence isn't test scores. Evidence includes much beyond that. And we spend a lot of time teaching our students, when you give a piece of work, no matter what it is, whether it be a test, whether it be assignment, whether it be performance, what you're looking for on that work is the evidence of your impact on their learning. And from the student point of view, when you ask students about feedback, for example, the thing they say absolutely clearly, that feedback works for them when it tells them where to next. So teachers, look at that work and your question you're asking is, now where to?
So we talked a little bit about pre-service instructors and how they might use this book. How might principals and other administrators use this book?
Well, the same thing. Like I've learned over the years. Like one thing I know about myself is that as a university academic, I'm a talker, and so I've learned very quickly that going into schools, I can entertain. They can say it's valuable, but nothing changes. So about 7 or 8 years ago, I built a team around me that are very good at doing in schools. And so we go into schools and we have the same kind of notions. We start off with saying it's about your mind frame, it's about your dispositions. What do you think your job is? And then we show them how to be evaluators. We use a lot of Ben Levin's work about success coordination. We're not interested in change. We're interested in understanding where success is in the school and then how you can grow that. I know it's the same thing, but the focus is quite different. And so we use lots of things like effect size changes, gain scores, the value added. We look at artifacts of the kids' work, and we do all that up front. We don't start with the teachers. And then we feed that back, and we say, now this is the situation. We do a lot of work with the schools to saying, what do you think impact is in the school? And then how would you increase that? And then from that, we build a program logic with the school. We teach them how they can understand better how they can evaluate what they're doing. And we don't go in and say there's a magic answer, there's no magic bullet. We don't go in with a recipe. We say it's all about how you can better evaluate your learning. It's this whole notion of I know it's often called instructional leadership. I prefer to call it evaluation leadership. And that's your fundamental role. We've never met anyone yet that doesn't want to improve kids' learning in multiple ways. Let's give them the tools to show when they're doing it. Because here's the other problem. We're terrible in education at acknowledging success. When you have a successful lesson, or you're running a successful school, very often we attribute that to the kids. It was actually us. Yeah. And the problem is that when we don't acknowledge success, we demand more and more and more and more of our teachers. And sometimes we don't stop and say, hey, I've got evidence we're doing a stunning job. That's how we try and run our schools.
You have described in here looking at over 800, 900 meta-analysis. So you've used a lot of data. That's collecting a lot of data and a lot of exercises and there's a lot of information here. So how might schools, particularly principals and teachers, gather their own data and use that for their understanding of their teaching?
Well, that's why I go back to evidence as a contested word. I've used a particular kind of evidence. I'm not expecting schools to do meta-analyses and that kind of stuff. Yes, it is the case that when a school contracts to work with us, and there's quite a few thousand now that do work with the team, one of the things we demand is that at least a 0.5 position, senior position, be a success coordinator. And we work very closely with that person to give them some of the tools, such as how to calculate effect sizes, how to do it down to the individual. And then we say to that person, now we want you to go out there in the schools that you're working in, look at the programs running and help those fellow teachers to think about what evidence they'd accept that they're having an impact on student learning, and then use the tools that you have then to do that work with them. We can't expect teachers to do all the stuff. And so the success coordinator does it, but their fundamental role is to not feed back that data or evidence to the teacher. It's to feed back the discussion that comes from it. And this is what is very healthy conversations. Teachers really do want to know their impact. Sometimes they're very biased in how they see their impact. They look at half a dozen kids doing really well and say, I'm doing a good job. We want every kid. And the other focus that we have that's very strong is that using the Ontario situation, we're not so interested in getting kids at level 1, 2, 3 or 4. Not because it's not important, but it doesn't make the difference. What our interest is, we say that every kid in Ontario has the right to at least a year's gain, a year's growth for a year's input. I have a good sense what that is. I can show you what that is. And so we then say to every teacher, does every kid make at least a year's growth in these subjects? What does it look like to have a year's growth? Let's get some moderation going on what it looks like. Let's get some advanced thinking. For example, we'll go into a class at the end of the first month. We'll do an assessment, we'll feed that back to the teacher. And the assessment doesn't have to be a test, it could be a performance. And then we say to that teacher, now, predict where you think that kid's going to end up at the end of the year. We then analyse that, success coordinator, and then we go back to the teacher and say, do you realise that the expectation you set for this kid is less than a year's growth? Or what? And that way we can get in front of the problem. And so we can then derive what success looks like and move to it.
In your writing, you indicate that student achievement is not the only goal of what we should be doing in schools. What are the other things?
Well, I have 4 boys who have been through the education system, and the research that drove me as a father was Henry Levin's, economist of education in this part of the world. And he said the best predictors of adult health, wealth, and happiness was not achievement at school. It's the number of years of schooling. So I have an abiding passion about retention rates. I spent a lot of my time, particularly in my New Zealand context, with government saying, how do we increase our achievement rates? 82, 84% is where New Zealand was 10 years ago. It's where you are now. It ain't good enough. We have to find multiple ways to engage kids to stay in school. And one of the ways of doing it isn't necessarily through the traditional canon of achievement, the physics, the maths, the history, whatever. There are multiple ways you can be excellent. And the other thing about schooling, which is really critical to me, it's the best chance we have of teaching character. And part of character to me is the ability to persist. It's the to know what you do when you don't know what to do. It's that sense of concentration and deliberate practice. It's mental toughness. Those are critical things you teach. Like, take concentration, take persistence. It's a taught skill. It's very tough to find any evidence about how to go about teaching it in the last 20 years. Now, unfortunately, we blame the kids or we drug them. I think that retention's critical to me, character's critical to me. Students who are turned on to a subject, whether it be water polo, whether it be physics, that's critical to me.
I'm going to go back to your meta-analysis for a few minutes.
Sure.
Because that's a lot of things to look at. How did you decide which studies to consider as part of this? There's thousands and thousands, and you picked 900.
Well, I picked 900 meta-analyses. That's around 50, 60,000 studies, so that's not a bad sample. And, I've got good squirrel-like behaviour, so I was able to do that. And it did take me 15 to 20 years to do all this. I actually wasn't that selective. I took everything I could find, and then I asked the question. Like, I didn't make the assumption that these were good studies or bad studies. I asked the question, did good studies or bad studies make a difference in terms of the interpretation? And I asked, because I was fundamentally looking for moderator effects. Where's the difference here? Does class size differ with 5-year-olds or 15-year-olds, etc.? So I collected all that kind of stuff to ask where it made a difference. I actually discovered there were very few moderators. What works best tends to work best across most kids. But that was an empirical question. And so a lot of my work was looking at the studies, looking at these different moderators that I could get hold of, and then asking, did it make a difference? So I was actually quite inclusive.
And you found early on that the effect size of 0.0, almost everything made a change. Everything changed something. So that was quite interesting. And then you eventually got to the point where 0.40 was your breaking point. If it was above, something was happening. If it was below, it could have just happened because we changed because something happened to us.
Or maturation.
Or maturation or something.
I think that was the thing that surprised me the most. Like, I started this with a new graduate from here. I went to my first job, and every academic told me that I had to do this because this is what made a difference to achievement. And every teacher told me, do what I do and you'll make a difference to achievement. And I couldn't understand why they could all find evidence that it worked, and they're all different. And now I understand why. If you set the benchmark at 0, which means any evidence of achievement is good enough, then about 98% of things work. Everything works. The standard line is that all you need to make a kid learn is a pulse. And that's when I said, well, is that good enough? Well, of course it's not good enough. And so what I use now is the average of all possible effects. And I know that some of my critics say that I'm setting only an average, and I'm saying that's not a bad thing to use. And what I find is that we do have teachers who regularly, systematically get greater than the average, and we do have teachers who regularly and systematically get below the average. My job is to work with schools to find out what their impact is, and then collaborate across the school to get all of them above that impact.
So you'd indicated a little bit of a surprise with the technique that you used. What about a surprise in your findings?
Well, it's like many years ago I was very influenced by Karl Popper's arguments about falsifiability and looking for negative evidence. And one of the things that I really spent a lot of time with the book is what's the story underlying these data? And I went through many stories, and sometimes the data told me I was absolutely wrong. And that's why it took me 5 versions to try and get what the story was here. And so now that I do have a story, the know that I impact, the importance of showing kids up front what success looks like, it kind of fits very nicely with, the data's not disputing that in any way at this stage. I'm prepared to be wrong. Again, I know that my critics say that I ignore the home. In fact, there's a whole chapter on the home in there. I don't ignore it, except I do say that once the kid crosses the school gate, we can't do much about it. And the thing that impresses me is the number of schools where they have incredible success with those kids. We can do it, and we can get greater than those effects.
I had worked with a number of schools that had challenging circumstances. A number of things: poverty, the number of different languages in the classroom, the home situations, everything. Yet they were still being successful.
Well, I've just analysed the Australian data, and it's a politic there that's not so different from Ontario, where they've got a national assessment scheme like EQAO. They've got a My School website where all the data is released to everybody. They've got graphs of where every state and province falls and all that, all based on attainment, where the kids are in performance. So I asked a different question. I said, okay, let me ask the question about growth. Where is the growth? We actually have greater growth. Teachers have greater growth with below average kids and in low SES schools. Like, Australia's interesting. For the last 20 years, it's the only country gone backwards in PISA. And when Barry McGaw analyses where we've gone backwards, it's all the kids above the average. I think because of our politic is that we keep thinking these schools are challenges. Actually, we are better in those schools than we are in the cruisy suburb ones. So I think that's a thing that I keep pushing about. It's about growth. It's about growth. It's about growth. Then I want attainment. It ain't the other way around. And my advice to Ontario, as I've been doing over this last week, is you've actually got incredible growth over the last 5-7 years. Now it's time to switch to growth.
You've talked to quite a number of policymakers this past week. What advice have you given them?
Move to a growth discussion, because the first part of it is, like Ontario, we need to value teachers, because if we don't value them, we get into a whole politic of nastiness which doesn't help any kid. And acknowledge that you've had all these years of growth in your attainments, but switch the discussion more now to a growth debate and show that every kid has the right to a year's growth for a year's input, and acknowledge it when you see it. Keep going on the success notion you're doing, and constantly ask about the impact you're having on all the kids in your school. And from that, I think you can go to the next level. I think you also have to look very seriously at what you're going to do to make schools more inviting to that next group of kids to get above your 80-85% retention at the stage.
When you're working with different countries, and you've been in lots of different places, have you had a chance to get into some of the schools?
Oh, yes.
Many
In fact,
times?
most places I insist, like this week I insisted on day one that I go into some schools, and they arranged for me to go into some schools.
What did you see this time?
Oh, look, maybe I get to be shown selective schools,
Okay,
but
true.
I'm only interested in success. Like, one of my problems with some of our colleagues is we love to study failure, and we love to have, like, I was stunned when I picked up Maclean's, was about mid-March exercise, front cover, education in crisis. Yeah, you're number 5 in the world. You're doing a stunning job, and the community thinks you're in crisis? Wow, thank goodness you're not other countries. I saw some pretty impressive stuff. I went to a primary school, and I as I say in the book, I saw the passion. I saw teachers talking about the impact they're having on kids. I saw the impact and the evidence. And then went to a high school, different kind of discussion, different kind of context. Yeah, quite frankly, all I want to see is success. Yeah. There's plenty of it out there.
There is. You have been asked many questions. If you had a chance to interview John Hattie, what would you ask him?
Well, that's a good question. I think the thing is, how can you work better with... The biggest frustration I have in this business is teachers and principals aren't very good at attributing success to what they do. They always say, yeah, the kid's bright, the kid did this great work, the kid did this, the circumstances did this. And I think that the thing I'd ask John Hattie is, how do you get teachers and school leaders to actually recognise success dependably amongst themselves and esteem it without the negative side of that equation? Because unless we esteem ourselves, I don't think we as a profession are going to grow as much. Like, you don't hear other professions, like other professions have royal societies, directors of this, boards of this, where they have their very best having a major say in the profession. Why don't we? And I think that's the thing that I'd ask them. How do you go about solving that problem?
When you see success, celebrating success, there's lots of ways of doing it. You can have class parties, you can have
No, I don't want that.
What is it
I just
you're
want to
looking for?
acknowledge that when it happens. Like, I do this exercise usually with large groups where I look at a series of kids and I look at their change over time, and I ask the audience, what possible reasons can you think these children change? And I've done this hundreds of times with thousands and thousands of teachers, and not once ever have they said, it might have been the teacher. All I want them to acknowledge, hey, we had an impact. I'm not interested in gold stickers and in performance pay and all that. I just want a climate where we can collaboratively recognise the excellence that is attributed to what we do and not to the exercises we give them, the activities we give them, the fact that they've got lovely parents, they did their homework and all this kind of stuff. Getting more, and I don't want to be Pollyannish about it. I don't want it to happen just because we think we're doing a good job. I want the evidence of impact. I want that discussion amongst staff about impact, as we do in the schools we work to. Bring evidence of the change. And now let's have a discussion amongst the teachers whether that change is sufficient. And when it is, let's acknowledge it.
In many schools, particularly at this time, it's difficult for principals to hire new teachers, for example. What would a principal be looking for that might identify the kinds of characteristics in the teacher that you would want in your school?
Yeah, to me it comes back to those notion of mind frames. I'd be very much interested to hear whether the teacher thinks they are worried about their impact. I'd be very interested to teach to think, are you a change agent or are you a facilitator? I'd be very interested to say, what do you think challenges for kids? Because the last thing I want is do your best. I don't want to hear about teachers who've got lovely activities, not because they're not important, but they aren't the key step. I'd be very, like as I do in every interview for every job that I have in employment, I give them a task. And I think that's one of the things we don't do often enough, is we interview, but we don't see them in the performance. I want to see their performance. I want to know, are they talkers, like I am, which I wouldn't employ as a classroom teacher, or do they stop and listen? How do they create opportunities in classrooms to hear learning going on? And then simple question, do you believe that achievement change is possible for all kids? And some teachers don't believe it's possible change. They talk about challenges in schools and difficulty of homes. Now it's Carol Dweck's shown. If you believe that, regardless of whether it's true, then you're less likely to change. So I'm interested in how they think about their job.
And whether or not that their children, their students can be successful.
Correct. And how would you know? How would you know you're having an impact? And as I've convinced, for instance, in New Zealand, the inspectorate system when they go around schools, you don't go and ask someone when you're employing someone for their data. The minute you do that, you get the data. You ask them, well, what's the nature of the evidence that you'd have that you're having an impact, and what would you do about it? And so when you come to interview, I want to see some evidence of impact. Now, if you bring a test, in my opinion, you failed. If you don't bring a test, you probably failed. But I want to look at the richness of what you think evidence is and what you think impact is. That's what I want to look for in an interview.
So if someone brought along a portfolio, for example, what would they put in there?
Well, I think that's up to them. What I'm interested in is how they think about it, how rich it is, how variety it is, how does it reflect all students and not just the best? And then the key question next, after they've done that and they've convinced me, now what are you going to do about these kids now? You've got this. Where to next? Because our job never stops.